is he's looking at the curious fact to say, how is it that capitalism came to be? It seems to be this compilation of behaviors, and not only that, but the compilation of behaviors that we know as capitalism is totally contrary to religious teaching 400 years ago. Again, working hard all the time, seeing God only in work. And he's saying, well, this is a real puzzle, like how these two realities came to be. And as I've already alluded to before, he identified a couple of key things. One is he looked at this idea of calling. And he said, well, the Catholics had one way about calling, and they were basically kind of, they were absolved of any worry about their afterlife by their church. They could go to church and get forgiveness or a sacrament and basically have this kind of continual connection with God in a way that assured them of an afterlife. And what this led to was no change. It was kind of like the status quo, if you will. This is his claim. So he says, well, that's not going to lead to capitalism because there's no kind of push to do anything different. Then he says, well, there's this Lutheran call. And the Lutheran call is different than the Catholic call in that we should see whatever life situation we landed into as the particular way that God wants us to live out our relationship to God in this world. But basically there was no kind of tension, if you will, that would make people want to kind of break basically that status quo. So it was a little bit similar to the Catholics in kind of status quo, but we start to get this much more kind of individual, like the church isn't there to protect us, so while you're working out the status quo, stay on the narrow path, right? So don't do anything wrong. And so he says, that doesn't really lead to capitalism. Then we get to Calvinism. And this, for Weber, is where everything shifts. Because a couple of key points. There is no guarantee of salvation, unlike the Catholics. There's no evidence of salvation, unlike the Lutherans, where at least if you were kind of doing whatever it is you do well, so whether you were like a serf in the fields or king, as long as you kind of did it well, that was evidence of salvation. Calvinist says there's no guarantee of salvation, there's no evidence of salvation, and for Weber this has a huge unintended consequence. And what it means, and this is where the idea is a switchman, where it changes the direction in history. It means that individuals, to relieve the anxiety, I don't know if I'm going to heaven or not, to relieve that anxiety, they will work hard, they will save up, and they will not spend. Okay? These key virtues that then lead to dun 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 capitalism. So his is very much an argument about the development of capitalism based on religious ideas, religious belief, religious culture. And remember, it's this Calvinism thing, it's a this worldly asceticism. So we're going to work hard in this world, and the only way we can work out our salvation is by what occurs in this world. And what's interesting is in Calvinism, it's not that this gets you saved, like working hard and saving up gets you saved. No. If that were the case, it might not be so anxiety inducing. What Calvinists took it to mean was that if you're doing these things, then that's likely evidence that you are saved, though we still don't quite know if you're saved. Okay, so there's a lot of anxiety, if you will, connected to this. And so Weber's argument is that over time, these sort of behaviors, especially by large swaths of communities or nations, had an effect on basically getting the engine of capitalism, with basically the capital that was laying around as was kind of the work oriented towards always kind of generating more capital. So it's a pretty controversial argument. Excuse me. What happens then is a little bit sad for Weber, and this is where the end of his reading comes in. A couple of things happen. First off, it's very natural that soon after this, and many of you picked up this, people will use what people do in their lives as a way to know whether they've been saved. So it's like, oh, if I see Bobby working hard, saving up, and not spending, I can probably assume that he's been saved, and so therefore it's legitimate to have all that nice money. Whereas Tommy down the street, well, You know, he's kind of lost his job a couple of times. He never, I don't think he ever studied hard enough. His house isn't that big. Oh, well, that must mean that he doesn't have the favor of God, because if he did, these sorts of things would be showing up. So you start to get these spiritual legitimations and justifications for capitalism. And then the bigger thing for Weber, and this is really important, this was his example of Benjamin Franklin, is what happens eventually is that this Calvinistic, this worldly asceticism, which drove the activities that led to capitalism, also restrained people from spending money, from making stupid investments, from being lazy and just making money off of the stock market. Those things were all off the table because there was this kind of strong moral religious element to this sense of call. What Weber says happens over time is that the activity of capitalism, work, save, that sort of thing, delinks from the religious idea of Calvinism, and eventually we get the capitalism that we see today. He uses Ben Franklin as an example, and Ben Franklin has this long list of all these cool little things you should do to be productive and make money. But there's nothing in there about the fact that it's all geared towards this trying to have a sense of what your afterlife will be like. And there's also not a sense of restraint in Benjamin Franklin's aphorisms. And then, as many of you noted today, in our economy right now, there's anything but evidence. You know, it's all contrary evidence to what Weber was talking about. Instead, you're saying, well, what about, you know, these corporate jets and people tricking people, and people not heeding warnings, not spending wisely, bankers jilting people, all the lawmakers not having correct oversight. And some of you said, well, if Weber thought that at the beginning this linked religious vision could kind of generate capitalism, is it possible that if these things came back together today, capitalism would clean up? Weber didn't think so, because as some of you caught right at the end of that reading, he says a couple of things. He says that we are now, and this is writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we are now caught in the iron cage of rationality, where before this capitalistic activity was begun out of a value rational activity that was oriented towards salvation. That became delinked, and all we have left anymore is the activity itself. And so now we do these activities because this is what we're supposed to do. This is the way it's done, which is much more of a utilitarian or an instrumental rationality of just these kind of specific behaviors that you're just supposed to do because you're just supposed to do, which is very different than Weber saw as the root of things. And he sees this pulling apart. He says, now we're in this iron cage of rationality where we don't even know why we're doing these capitalistic things, but we do them, and they drive us hard, and they create kind of the modern mess, if you will, that he was looking at that time. And so there's a part of Weber, especially at the end of the reading, where he's kind of pleading, at some level, pleading for this, what he would call the re-enchantment of the world. So basically reconnecting those beliefs with the everyday activity of the world to see if basically the genie could be put back in the bottle, if things wouldn't become so bad anymore. And I was very intrigued that a lot of you said, well, isn't that interesting? Could we think of this day and age of whether things would be different with the economy if that were to happen now, if we were to kind of revert back almost to that early